Welcome to this class on Saki's short story, Hermann the Irascible. This short story is very interesting because it offers several layers of interpretation. But in order to fully understand these various layers or levels, I should say, of interpretation, it is important for you to have a background knowledge in particular on the main topic discussed in the short story, that is women's suffrage, the vote for women. The vote for women is clearly linked to women's condition in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Women's condition improved a lot in the 19th century, although I wouldn't say tremendously, but improved a lot in various fields. At home, married women's condition improved in terms also of education and politically speaking. And all were linked, of course. In terms of education, although education remained gendered well into the 20th century, notable improvements were made, in particular concerning higher education. For a long time, women were not allowed to study at university. London University was the first university to open its door to women, and the first to accept women to degrees in 1880. Oxford and Cambridge accepted women in 1863, but would not accept women to take a degree before 1920 for Oxford and 1947 for Cambridge. At home too, a number of improvements were made, and in particular concerning married women. Married women's belongings and possessions, which until 1881 were the entire property of their husband. When a woman was working, her wage was actually her husband's. She had no right, no claim on her wage or on her inheritance that was passed to her husband. And more importantly, it's only in 1884, with the passing of the Married Women Property Act, that for the first time a married woman was considered as a separate individual. So far, a married woman was considered basically as her husband's property. So eventually, in 1884, women were considered a separate individual. Until then, a woman needed her husband's consent for almost everything. Well, if women open a business or to sue someone in court. So that was a great achievement. Now, politically speaking, I would say that the road to female suffrage was a long road, and even longer than the road to male suffrage. As indeed, the priority, politically speaking, the priority had always been male suffrage. At the beginning of the 19th century, only a tiny portion of the population could vote, less than 6%, and those who could vote were exclusively rich men. And steadily, throughout the 19th century, a number of parliamentary reforms were passed, extending the franchise to a wider portion of the population, that is, including more men from lower classes. The first such reform was passed in 1832, which included middle-class men, rich enough, but middle-class men, no longer aristocrats. The qualification at the time was the £10 householding, that is, men owning a house worth £10 a year could vote. That was the qualification, the basis to vote, basic conditions to vote. The franchise was further extended to working class men in 1867 and 1884, when the qualification ceased to be the £10 householding, but any man owning his house and the £10 occupier, that is, any man renting a house worth £10 could vote. So that, of course, including, and paying rates, local rates, that including a lot of men, working class men. The very poor were still excluded from the vote, nonetheless. Note in passing the £10 condition to vote, either the owner, occupier, or the lodger, is in Saki's short story. The sanction for women who fail to vote is £10. So, of course, £10 was a huge sum, and that must be taken into account when studying the story, because it's a direct link, a direct hint at voting qualification. So, as I said, the priority had been men's vote, and well, the reason why is that women were naturally considered as inferior to men. That's the first thing, and it was believed that if men were asking for, if people were asking for universal suffrage, including men and female suffrage, that would never be granted. So the first step was universal male suffrage, and then female suffrage could be contemplated. So this is the reason why, in the 1860s, late 60s and 80s and late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, once most men, working class men, had been given the vote, it was finally possible to envisage wider campaigns for female suffrage. And actually in 1869, unmarried women were granted the vote at local elections. Unmarried, of course, because 1869, that was before the passing of the 1884 Married Women's Property Act that freed women from their husband's authority. So that was a very important step. So women who were ratepayers, that is, women of some, women who had some property, rich women, could vote at local elections. But it was definitely a first step. And this is the reason why at this time a number of societies were actually founded to campaign for women on women's vote on a wider basis, that is, general election. As I said, a lot of societies were founded, including actually men's societies, campaigning for females' votes. Women were supported by men too. The two main societies, though, who occupied the political stage in terms of female suffrage were the National Union of Suffrage Societies, that was founded in 1897, and whose leader was Millicent Fawcett. And the second society was the WSPU, Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst. These were the suffragettes. There's a distinction between the suffragists, who campaigned for female suffrage, but through constitutional and peaceful methods, such as Millicent Fawcett and the National Union of Suffrage Societies, and the suffragettes, who resorted to violent methods. And that was the case of the WSPU and Emmeline Pankhurst followers. So the WSPU was founded in 1903 because they thought that peaceful methods were no solution, that they could never be heard. Again, the idea was not so much to convince men to give women the vote, but the suffragettes believed that it was about time that men realised that female women and men were equal. And when asked why they resorted to violent methods, the suffragettes would say, well, when an Irish man resorts to violent methods, people just understand it. Say he resorts to violent methods because he's not heard, is not granted, the Irish are not granted independence or home rule, so they resort to violent methods. Why should it be different for women who are asking for the vote? Violent methods are just political means. So that was the argument I would put forward to justify their campaign of violence, including arsons, breaking windows, etc. Note that, or chaining themselves, is mentioned in Saki's short story. Note that these women and these violent women were portrayed in the press as hysterical, crazy women that could not be taken seriously, although their discourse was a political discourse. Nonetheless, these political, I should say, methods and violent methods were counterproductive, as a number of bills were passed in 1911 and 12 that they were not passed, they were introduced in Parliament to give women the vote, but they were all rejected because it was impossible for the government to accept, to pass a bill giving women the vote, provided this campaign of violence, because they would have been blamed for yielding to violence. So these methods were counterproductive. So as I said, they would resort to breaking windows, etc., but also to hunger strikes, because they were arrested, of course, and when in jail, they would go on hunger strike and they would be force-fed. Now, possibly there's a link between, the cat being choked with cream in Saki's short story and the suffragettes, prisoners, being force-fed. Now, women were finally granted the vote in 1918 for a number of reasons, but one among the many reasons is the fact that Asquith was no longer the Prime Minister. Asquith was the Prime Minister at the time Saki wrote his story, and Hermann is I believe, a parody of Asquith, the Prime Minister, who was a Liberal Prime Minister, a progressive Prime Minister. Under his government, major social reforms were passed as the first forms of old age pensions or unemployment and sickness benefits for workers. But however progressive he could be, he was strongly opposed to women's vote. Now, there's another thing I would like to add, because there's a reference to it in Saki's story, is divorce. As far as divorce is concerned, women and men were not equal at all. To obtain a divorce, a man just had to prove his wife's adultery, whereas for a woman, she had to prove her husband's adultery plus gross cruelty, bigamy, and sodomy. It's only in 1925 that women just had to prove their husband's adultery, and that's it. So, there's a hint at, in Saki's story, a hint at famous divorce cases. Divorce was very expensive, even at the beginning of the 20th century, and only the very rich could afford it. Now imagine the very rich and plus, sodomy or homosexuality, which was illegal until 1967. That would definitely make the headlines. Also note in passing that Saki was homosexual, and he might have, felt particularly concerned about such trials or divorce cases. Thank you very much for your attention.